Everyone, we're going to get started. There's still folks signing the sign-in sheet, so we'll have people trickling in. But want to make sure that we start on time. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to the TAP Colloquium. Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Brandon Barker join us. I'm bringing up my notes so I remember to. If you haven't, make sure you sign up on the sign-in sheet. Many of you already did. Thank you. But yeah, so we'll have a talk today from Brandon, Colloquium. I ask that if you have questions that are clarity questions, you can ask those during the talk, raise a hand or something. But otherwise, let's try to save those towards the end. But yeah, so today we have Dr. Brandon Barker. So Brandon did his bachelor's in science at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he worked with Tony Mezzacappa, doing some really great work on supernovae, code development, these things. And then having met on Astro Twitter years ago, he messaged me and said, "Hey, how's Michigan State?" And I was like, it's pretty awesome. You have to live in East Lansing, but it's pretty awesome." And so he joined me at Michigan State, where he got dual PhDs in astronomy and astrophysics and computational mathematics, science, and engineering, where he led a lot of works looking at models and simulations of supernovae, connecting with observations. And then Brandon kept on taking my advice when he asked where he should go after. And now he's at Los Alamos National Lab, where he is a Metropolis postdoctoral fellow, where he leads a lot of efforts for code development, but also still thinking about theoretical astrophysics. And so he's going to share with us some of the work that he's been doing. And today he is around. He has 2 slots open if you'd like to meet with Brandon tomorrow morning. But other than that, I encourage you to stay in touch with them and connect with them asynchronously and ask any questions you might have about his work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brandon Barker.
That introduction, Carl. I'm a little hurt you needed notes since I followed you around so much. Yeah, so I'm going to be subjecting you to some of my thoughts on core collapse supernova light curves, their modeling and inference challenges. And this will be a bit from a biased perspective, as I'm now someone who thinks almost entirely about scientific software, numerical methods, and how we can actually get some science out of these models so that we can learn something about the explosions and their stars. I'm going to start maybe a little weirdly with the stanza of a poem that I come back to a lot when I try to think of what is the role of supernovae in the field broadly and my role in the field as a practitioner. And this isn't an undergrad class, so I'll only subject you to one reading. But splendors of elemental tribe, smit suns that startle back the gloom, new light whose tale of stellar doom bears to uncomprehending life. This was written by George Sterling, who I think was in the wrong career. In 1901 or 1902, published in 1907. And in these years, we had no idea what a star was or what a supernova was or what quantum mechanics was. But I find it does a great job of describing the key aspects broadly of the stellar life cycle. Burning, bright, this new light that we used to think of as new stars, and ultimately a tale of stellar doom, which is, to me, at the highest level, what a supernova is. It's the final testimony of a dying star. And our role as modelers or stellar astrophysicists or observers or whatever we call ourselves is to find a way to take that testimony, things that we're seeing, we're hearing in the night sky, and understand it. Now, it's not the first decade of the 20th century anymore, so we can be a little bit more specific and detailed than the stanza of a poem. We know now that core collapse supernovae are the ends of lives of very massive stars. These are something like 8, 9, 10 times the mass of the sun and beyond. The lower bound remains elusive. These stars at the ends of their lives exhaust their nuclear fuel and lose their battle with gravity and begin to collapse. That collapsing core eventually separates into 2 separate pieces, a inner and outer core that are out of causal contact. So one is supersonic, one is subsonic. And the shock starts to build up as the core compresses into nuclear densities where the strong force starts to become repulsive. It doesn't want to collapse anymore. And we launch this outward moving shock. We used to think that that shock was just the supernova. It collapses, bounces, explodes. It's not quite so simple. As that shock moves through the outer parts of the iron core, it rips those iron nuclei apart, which is requiring a huge amount of energy. Eventually, there's also a burst of neutrinos that have been formed behind that shock as it rips everything apart, which robs the shock of even more energy. And that shock stalls inside the iron core, fizzles out, and turns into not an explosive shock, but a standing accretion shock, where it's not moving. The rest of the star is still pounding in on top of it. And the name of the game for a very long time was, how does that shock revive? We know it has to stall because the dissociation of iron group nuclei is extremely expensive, or energetically expensive. And we know that it has to revive because there are supernovae. We see them all the time. And so we now know that it is some combination of neutrino matter interactions. There's copious amounts of neutrinos being released from the inner iron core, or the protoneutron star, as they diffuse out, release. And the interplay of hydrodynamics instability, so convection, turbulence, and global instabilities like this standing accretion instability, where everything is pounding in on top of this stalled shock and sloshing it around and moving the heating zones around. And so eventually the shock is revived and we see supernovae. Why do we care, besides the fact that they're really cool explosions in space and they're fun to model on a computer? Well, everything basically on this periodic table, unless it was Big Bang nucleosynthesis or a few other things, is related somehow to a core collapse supernova. I'm being a little bit cheeky with that, but you have things that are fused in massive stars throughout their normal lives through the stellar burning cycles. If that star explodes, they get flung out. In that explosion, you're going to have explosive burning, so additional nucleosynthesis that happens in the supernova ejecta, something like titanium. That gets distributed out through the cosmos as well. After this is all said and done, there may be a compact object, or there will be a compact object left over. That might be a neutron star. That neutron star might have a friend, and they might merge and produce our process nucleosynthesis. So understanding core collapse supernovae helps us understand, in some way or another, almost everything on this periodic table. I'm now in part a terrestrial scientist, with part of my time thinking about other sources of high energy density physics. So supernovae, stars, and all these things are excellent laboratories for high energy density plasmas. These are plasmas at pressures greater than a megabar, or 10 to the 12 ergs per cubic centimeter. There's all kinds of fascinating phenomena in astrophysics that go into this regime. Supernovae, the relatively calm things like the interior of solar mass stars, the interiors of giant planets, things like this. But these happen in terrestrial settings all the time. So something like direct drive fusion, indirect drive fusion, inertial confinement fusion, or pulse power like Z-pinch experiments. And so here is shown a beautiful image of the Z machine at Sandia National Laboratory, where it does all kinds of cool fusion science. The methods that we use to study something like a core collapse supernova, on at least the computational side, are not that different from how we would study, on a modeling perspective, something like what's happening here. The challenges are different. There's no general relativistic gravity in this, or a fusion pellet. But in the supernova setting, we don't have to worry about the equation of state of aluminum, or what happens to aluminum under intense circumstances, or what happens when your computational cell is split by aluminum and air. What is the pressure of that non-mixed cell? And so studying things like supernovae and stellar plasmas can help us study something that could be very potentially impactful here on Earth. And it goes both ways. There are scientists at Sandia, the Z machine that I just showed, that are doing all kinds of great astrophysics historically, studying things like spectral emission from accretion objects. A lot of our knowledge of stellar opacities comes from experiments like this. They even study the formation and propagation of jets that look quite a lot like astrophysical jets, just on a very small scale. So there's a lot of crosstalk to be had. And as someone who went through an astrophysics PhD and didn't quite see the applications or have them shown to me, I find that it's great to see these things happening in the real world. Now I find I like to put my takeaways quite early on so that if anyone needs to leave, peace out, fall asleep, we all leave with something. And so I'll put my takeaways that we're going to go spend the rest of the time talking about. First and foremost is that all aspects of the supernova problem from t=0 to t=infinity are inherently multidimensional. We've been dealing with this problem since we've been observing supernovae, and we're going to continue to deal with it in new and exciting ways. Inference of, say, progenitor or explosion properties is highly degenerate. It turns out to be very hard to get a unique answer for how massive was a star or how energetic was the explosion from something like a light curve, completely ignoring all of those fun multidimensional aspects that we just mentioned. This is a bit of a soapbox, but I think progress moving forward is going to require progenitors that are as diverse as nature can imagine. That means a single star. That means a star with friends, binaries, multiples. It means rotation rates, everything. And where I spend my time is I think there's a lot of exciting progress happening in the methods and modeling space that's going to help us answer some of these questions and more moving forward. So we can talk a bit about the multidimensional nature of supernovae. I mentioned it is this interplay of neutrino heating. This neutrino heating may be asymmetric with dipolar emission. You have simultaneous inflows and outflows where that accretion from one pole or one axis accretes onto your compact object, heats it and enhances the neutrino luminosity and helps drive the explosion. And then we have all these hydrodynamic instabilities, convection, turbulence, interactions of accreting matter onto a stalled shock that can slosh it around, what's called a standing accretion shock instability, and further increase the effectiveness of neutrino heating. And it's been the case for a very long time that the explosion mechanism does not operate in spherical symmetry. From the onset of our ability to model supernovae with semi-realistic neutrino physics, we've been unable to blow something up in 1D in spherical symmetry without faking it. And we've gotten very good at faking it. We can talk more about that later if we want, but we require multi-dimensional effects from those hydrodynamic instabilities to drive a supernova. That explosion that launches is inherently multidimensional. And those asymmetries that start from deep in the star are going to carry all the way out to shock breakout. So here we're looking at a simulation plot of radial velocity at shock breakout. So this was a 15 solar mass blue supergiant, I think. We have all this fascinating structure as the material is puncturing out of the stellar surface, which is not pictured because it's not moving. And this is all owed to hydrodynamic effects as the shock and ejecta move out through the star. We can drive up Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities, Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities that dredge up, for example, metals from inside of the star in the core out into the envelope and mix things around. These asymmetries are present not only in the ejecta structure, but in the metals that we see. So on the left side is the oxygen distribution for one of their models. The right side is nickel. Nickel is responsible for a huge amount of what we actually see. And so the distribution of that ejecta matters a lot for powering the light curve. And all of this depends on the progenitor structure. Right? A blue supergiant is going to have a different pattern from a red supergiant, where in the red supergiant, you have this huge extended hydrogen envelope where you have all kinds of time. Shock breakout timescales are something like 24 hours to drive up these hydrodynamic instabilities, mix things out, etc. Blue supergiants, relatively speaking, are very small. The shock blows through it almost instantly, and you have no time to drive up Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities or Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities, for example. So it depends on knowing the stellar structure, and it depends on the interaction of those shock dynamics and the stellar structure. So the takeaway is that for this slide is that an asymmetric explosion, which is the nature of a true neutrino-driven explosion, can seed asymmetric ejecta. This is not exactly new. We can look at what happens at shock breakout. folks in the last few years have taken to modeling spherical, artificially driven explosions, but thinking about now a three-dimensional red supergiant hydrogen envelope that's convective, it's bubbling around. Now we're not in spherical symmetry. There's not a uniquely defined constant stellar radius r, but something that wibbles and wobbles around. Jared called them mountains and valleys, where the radius of the star depends on where you're looking at the star. If it's convectively bubbling, it's going to have a larger radius than somewhere that's in a convective valley. And this turns out to be really impactful for the shock breakout signal. So a spherically symmetric shock breakout signal from like a 1D simulation tends to be very confined in time, very short. That's the blue curve at the top. Easy to interpret, but not what we actually see. Observations, the few that we have of shock breakouts, tend to be extended more over hours instead of the minutes or whatever it is of a spherically symmetric simulation. And Jared showed that this is attributed potentially to the 3D structure of the hydrogen envelope. So the orange line up top is one of his 3D envelope models that was exploded. And the shock breakout timescale was spread out over many hours compared to this 1D simulation. And the light lines there are different viewing angles. So the duration and pattern morphology of that shock breakout signal depends on what angle you're looking at the star from. This is really important because shock breakout timescale illustrations have been historically used to try and constrain the stellar radius, where the shock breakout duration in a spherical star could be related to something like the radius of the star divided by the speed of light, a simple crossing timescale. But that doesn't work the second that your star is non-spherical and you have these mountains and valleys. It becomes perhaps impossible to back out the radius of your star without knowing the actual 3D structure of that envelope. Folks have taken this a step further and done 3D simulations evolved out to 100 days, which is relatively new and rather a heroic calculation, but David Buchanan coupled 3 or 4 different codes, initiating a 3D neutrino-driven supernova simulation in their closed code Fornax, mapping that now developed explosion into flash, following its shock trajectory all the way out to the stellar surface. That would give something like the plots we saw at first, where you have nickel distributions and pumpy shock breakout. And then putting that shock breakout structure into another 3D radiative transfer code, Sedona, so that they could follow it out in homologous expansion for 100+ days and look at the viewing angle dependence of the light curve and spectra, for example. And they found something like factors of 2 variance in the total volumetric luminosity across the plateau and in the radioactive tail, owed to different distributions of nickel along different viewing axes. So the brighter curves there might have more nickel looking down the line of sight and a bigger projected emission surface along that particular line of sight compared to the others. And so this is an example of an asymmetric explosion in a spherical star, leading to asymmetric properties, whereas before we've had both asymmetric explosions, spherical stars, spherical explosions, asymmetric stars, all leading to asymmetric properties. Folks have done this before in the same kind of thing in more simplified ways, where they faked a supernova structure, 3D structure, and put clumps in the envelope, so over densities that would lead to a longer or shorter photon diffusion timescale. You get a similar kind of argument. Volumetric luminosity of your observed light curve depends on the structure of those clumps, the 3D nature, and your viewing angle. So the takeaway from these last 2 slides, either seeded by an asymmetric explosion or an asymmetric stellar structure, observables are going to be impacted by this. Why not both asymmetric stars and asymmetric explosions? This has been done a little bit by folks like Carl and others, where instead of thinking about like a 3D envelope, we want to think about a 3D stellar core. That's where all of the explosion launching business happens. So what folks have tried to do, Carl included, is model in 3D something like 10 or 15 minutes prior to core collapse, allowing for the silicon and oxygen layers, for example, to start burning convectively, seeding a non-spherical structure in that inner core. Once we go through collapse, bounce, and a shock, that shock is going to hit these asymmetries, which seed long or larger asymmetries, which can strengthen the post-shock turbulence convection, leading to more robust explosions. So the 3D nature of that progenitor star in its core matters for launching a stronger, more asymmetric explosion. Go out, follow into your asymmetric envelope, and you get something probably crazy, but no one has ever done that. There's a number of open questions thinking about the supernova explosion model. Some of these I didn't talk about. Fat neutrino oscillations are extremely hot right now, not the MSW ones that were popular way back, but something like fast flavor neutrino oscillations, where crossings in the angular distribution of neutrinos and antineutrinos can lead to nanosecond scale inversions of the neutrino population. It is completely unclear whether this actually happens in a supernova environment, and it's unclear if it matters. You could get complete inversion of your electron neutrinos into something else that doesn't care about your matter and destroy your explosion. You could turn everything else into electron neutrinos, power your explosion more energetically. It is a very open problem right now because it happens on like nanosecond, nanometer timescales that we cannot resolve whatsoever in these simulations. Are some fraction of our process nucleosynthesis elements actually produced in some weird supernovae remains open. I talked about asymmetric explosions in symmetrical stars, and I talked about symmetrical explosions in asymmetrical stars. Completely open what happens and how drastic the situation is when you have both. How important are those viewing angle effects that folks like David Vartanian have demonstrated on inference? A factor of 2 is pretty large. We also don't know which stars explode. That neutrino-driven mechanism is really fickle. The neutrinos only need to deposit something like 1% of their energy into the stellar interior, but neutrinos don't like to interact, and sometimes that shock revival in our models can fail. For some people, it's unclear whether this is real. For me, it's unclear for which ones it happens. It's certainly a harder observational problem to find something that doesn't explode than it is to find something that does explode. I'm going to shift now into inference. So thinking about how, when we see one of these light curves, how do we actually learn anything from it? And in my mind, this is split into sort of 2 approaches, at least when we're thinking about light curves. There's semi-analytic models, something like Popov 1993, where you're going to use super simplified equations, self-similar scaling laws, and a whole host of assumptions to write down some equation for the luminosity or the energy of your experience. These are nice because they're super easy to use. You could, with a click of a button, apply it to every supernova that has data. But there's huge numbers of assumptions that go into these analytic models. Spherical symmetry, for example, and a whole host of other things that probably aren't realized at all in nature. On the other hand, which is a bit closer to where I sit, there's numerical modeling. So solving something like radiation hydrodynamics equations on a mesh, possibly time-dependent, possibly not, to produce synthetic observables. So a fake bolometric light curve or broadband light curve, a synthetic spectra, something like that, to compare to observations to try and back something out. This is more realistic. It helps us, we can, depending on how much physics you put into your model, capture non-LTE effects, recombination, all manner of things, up to the full kit and caboodle supernova physics. It removes many of those underlying assumptions. It is more time intensive, somewhere from a little bit more time intensive to massively more time intensive, depending on the assumptions in your model. Is it 1D, 3D, so on? And so I said at the beginning, I think it's my job to try and interpret this testimony of the dying star, try and work backwards from what it's telling us to what actually happened. This is a hugely interdisciplinary problem. Observations provide us broadband light curves, spectral information. Maybe in my lifetime, one more neutrino or a gravitational wave. And then combining that with something like forward modeling. So we vary progenitor properties, explosion properties, providing synthetic observables that we can compare to those observations. And then we hopefully can work back out what are the exact properties of that star. We can ask questions. How big was the star? How much nickel or other radioactive isotopes or nucleosynthetic products were produced? Turns out that this is massively difficult. Light curve morphology, like I've mentioned, depends on the progenitor properties and the explosion properties. And these are super degenerate. So say you want a shorter plateau duration, you can get that by a more energetic explosion. It's going to expand faster, cool faster, for example, or you can have a less massive envelope for your recombination wave to go back through. And so there's different combinations of stellar properties and explosion properties can give you an identical light curve. So here we're looking, the gray is observations of supernova 2017 EAW for bolmetric luminosity on the top and iron line velocity on the bottom. And the different colored curves are different MESA models with different explosion properties that all match the same light curve. And these span something like, in ZAM's mass, almost 10 solar masses and a factor of half 10 to the 51 ergs in explosion energy, which is to say we know nothing about the star from this analysis anyway. And so the question would be, how do we break that degeneracy? I pulled up some numbers for the recentish supernova 2023 IXF. It's the closest core collapse supernova that's happened in ages. And as of yesterday or the day before on not ADS, but Sky Explorer, has something like 400 hits for text containing supernova 2023 IXF. That said, light curve modeling suggests it could be 10 to 17 solar masses. So that's the process that we talked about there. It has pre-explosion imaging in, I suppose, Hubble. That suggests something like 8 to 12 solar masses, but those analyses are quite fraught. Nebular spectral analysis from late time spectra suggests less than 12 up to 19 solar masses. And it also has evidence for CSM interaction, so maybe it's actually a binary product or a strip star. So my take from that is that we know nothing about it besides CSM interaction, but about its mass, we know nothing. So how do we move on from this? Well, all of these analyses said, I'm going to twiddle the explosion energy, I'm going to twiddle the properties of the stellar progenitor completely independently. That's not how it happens in nature. A star of a given structure is going to explode in a single deterministic way. So if we happen to know how that particular star should explode, we can remove one of those knobs entirely. So that's what I spent a good chunk of my PhD working on, was taking spherically symmetric but neutrino-driven explosion models that have effectively a turbulence model in them to drive those explosions in a way that's consistent with 3D simulations. So it takes a Reynolds average Navier-Stokes approach to incorporate turbulence into the hydro equations. And those 3D parameters in there get tuned to actual 3D simulations. And the result is that we can get something that matches 3D results very well in terms of, does it explode, with what energy does it explode, and so on. Because they're 1D, it's very cheap to run these out to 200 days and look at the light curves. And we can say, does a real supernova of a given neutrino-driven energy match observations? And they can. So for 2017 EAW, which we looked at before, the neutrino-driven energetic suggests something like 20 solar masses, which was consistent with some of the thermal bomb, the fake explosions, and maybe ruled out some of the others. It's probably not the be-all and the end-all. It doesn't match with other inferences. And we can do that not just for individual stars, but entire populations. So here we're looking at a population of type 2 supernova progenitors in velocity and luminosity space. The crosses are observations, the dots are the neutrino-driven models. If we ignore the weird guys up in the corner, we match very well. We're a little offset in velocity, but we have to fake the velocity that we're comparing to because they're iron line observations and we don't have iron lines out of a volumetric code. But I find this very exciting because not that long ago, we couldn't blow up stars at all. Now we can do them by the hundreds and match observations at a landscape level quite well. Now I'm going to end with the stuff that I actually like thinking about most of my time now is where are we going in the future? I'm spending most of my time now writing a new radiation hydrodynamics code, Atlas, that hopes to succeed some of these previous models that have been used to generate light curves. It advances on them in a number of ways. It uses a two-moment transport scheme, so we allow for separate radiation and matter temperatures, which maybe doesn't matter deep in the star, but out in the low optical depths opacity can easily be realized. It hopes to be very user-friendly, so adding new physics is supposed to be very easy. If someone wanted to go and add an R-process heating model, study some other exotic transients, this should be rather simple. It's parallelized, and it uses some maybe not quite off-the-shelf numerical methods, discontinuous Colloquian methods that should allow it to achieve rather high-order accurate solutions with a smaller mesh. It has quite a lot. It's almost ready for production. Said it's two-moment Lagrangian radiation hydrodynamics, Saha ionization coupled into the equation of state to follow the ionization of hydrogen, and actually any high Z species one wants, which is not trivial for Saha-Boltzmann. They like to blow up if Z gets too big. Fully coupled IMAX integration, so there is no unauthorized operator splitting, arbitrary orders in space and time, and soon a really tailored mixing model that can allow us to see the mixing of those heavy elements out into the outer ejecta. That was 1D. I'm also doing work in 3D, so I work on the code Phoebus. It's acronym I forgot, but it's 51 erg blows up a star. It's a general relativistic neutrino radiation hydrodynamics code, built GPU first to leverage modern heterogeneous exascale computing architectures. It has a number of nice features like a flexible metric system, so we can use Kershio metrics. We can drop in cosmological metric, flat Minkowski metric, whatever we want for the target application. Monte Carlo and moment-based neutrino transport, adaptive mesh refinement, a novel monopolar GR solver fine-tuned for core collapse supernova simulations, and a suite of other things. And we're working with Carl Fields and students here at University of Arizona to get this ready for core collapse supernova capabilities in the near future. Moving on things that I'm not quite as involved with, there's other core collapse supernova model or architectures coming up. The one that is the newest and shiniest is the combination of FlashX and Tornado, which is a very involved acronym. FlashX is one of the many now new versions of Flash that have spun up into the world, meant to be performance portable, running on GPUs, coupled to a newer adaptive mesh refinement library. Tornado uses discontinuous Colloquian-based methods to provide the neutrino transport into Flash for DOE reasons, which is actually very cool. There's been a big, long-standing problem in neutrino transport with moment methods where they can kind of break the Fermi-Dirac nature of neutrinos, where they have a particular distribution function. Finite volume methods can break that, and they're able to preserve the Fermi-Dirac nature of their neutrinos perfectly using their discontinuous Colloquian discretization. It's effectively open source so that anyone can grab it and start running supernova models right now. I've been appealing all day to the need for more progenitor models. I presume that these don't exist because it's rather hard to create large grids of stellar evolutionary models. This is what people tell me. I was working over the summer with a graduate student, soon to be postdoc, on trying to simplify this process. So using Gaussian process regression to create more converged stellar evolutionary grids and in principle as many parameter dimensions as one wants. And we demonstrated that you can, using this process, create a stellar evolutionary model grid that is more converged than a naive uniformly spaced grid in, say, mass, using less simulations. So hopefully that's going to be impactful in the near future. And I'll end with one that a lot of my collaborators were working on that I think is crazy and I still don't understand right, but it's tensor trains. the things that we want to model if we're doing them in 3D haven't been done because they're so expensive. And hardware acceleration, GPUs, are one way of bringing these results to us. All of the codes nominally that I just mentioned can make use of the GPUs to accelerate their calculations. This is a technique for algorithmic acceleration. In this particular example, it's of thermal radiation transport, but the idea is to decompose some costly and high-dimensional piece of your partial differential equations or your model. In this case, it's the specific intensity tensor into a product of lower dimensional tensors, exploiting some structure in those solutions to make the problem more tractable. And so for this particular problem, it's stellar irradiation. So there's two subgrid point sources that are illuminating on an opaque stellar cloud and casting a shadow using SN, so discrete ordnance radiation transport with 500,000 angles, which is compared to what one would normally do 16 angles on a real calculation, seeing insane speedups and data compressions on a single node, doing problems that are completely intractable in traditional methods. I'll put up my summary. Either through their own explosions or the structure of stars, core collapse supernovae are inherently multidimensional, and that is a problem that we're going to deal with for the rest of our careers. Explosion and progenitor inference remains, in my view, an unsolved problem, even without those multidimensional effects, which hopefully we'll be wrangling with soon. But there's a lot of exciting methods, codes, and softwares that are coming out to hopefully help us start tackling these big problems.
So you mentioned 23 IXAB, which is like our golden case of a supernova where we have as much progenitor information as you would ever want to have. There's not just HST imaging, there's also Spitzer imaging, a long lifetime of Spitzer imaging. So we have a period of what the pulsational period looked like. We have near IR ground-based imaging, like 2 weeks before explosion that fits within that period. Literally all the data you could ask for. And yet, even when you take the pulsations into account, still we have a huge wide range of progenitor masses. And LSST will be optical, and so won't necessarily look at the near IR, which you really need to try and understand these red supergiants. What are some of the observational parameters that we should be looking for to try and separate degeneracies in progenitor modeling?
Neutrinos. If I knew, I would have put it in the talk. I really don't know. I'm a pessimist about it. I don't have a good answer for you.
Yeah, I think there's been so few sort of 3D to 3D to 3D to 3D simulations stitched together that there's just so much room for my view is that we have too much observational data, which is maybe like a bold statement to make, but I think that said a different way, we need to catch up with what we can do computationally. So you're seeing a big shift for people. GPU, the word GPU was mentioned, I don't know, maybe 100 times, but that's where we need to go with these models so that we can match and produce data at a larger scale for comparison to the observational data.
Yes, thanks for the great talk. So you mentioned these very rapid nanosecond scale neutrino oscillations. So I'm curious, what's the physical basis and would it have any implications for the neutrino masses? And my second question is there a way to capture some of those effects numerically? And have you thought about that?
So to the first question, no, I don't think it has any impact on the neutrino masses. My understanding of the phenomenon, which is rather limited, is that it occurs in 0 points or crossings of the neutrino angular distributions. And there's something about the quantum kinetics that are just unstable there. Which goes into the second question is, can we model this? And we absolutely can. The quantum kinetic equations provide us a way to do that directly. It's just super expensive to do. You can do it on a little nanometer box, that supernovae are not nanometer boxes. And so what people have been working on more recently is we call closure models. And so some way to incorporate the bulk effects of this on a macroscopic scale. Folks at North Carolina State are kind of leading that charge right now and have some kind of interesting results, but I don't know that they've come out conclusive to say how it impacts like explodability of stars, for example.
Any questions?
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I had a question about, I think it was slide 10. It was about the asymmetry of explosions and especially like how sensitive they are to initial conditions. So I was wondering, even if your single simulations can't tell you anything about like asymmetries for a specific case, can you draw any conclusions about a broad distribution of asymmetries, especially like as it pertains to like future gravitational wave sources? So like, will it unbind the binary? What kind of like orbital parameters? Like, yeah.
I think we can probably draw some large scale conclusions underpinned on the assumption of large scale assumptions of the progenitors. So like blue supergiants are probably going to behave mostly in a certain way compared to red supergiants. So in that way, we can probably draw some bulk conclusions, assuming we've done enough thinking about how the blue supergiants behave versus the red supergiants and knowledge of their populations. As for how that impacts like orbital unbinding, I am not sure.
I have a couple of questions, but maybe I'll start from one that is just a follow-up on this. So you're mentioning the distinction like between blue supergiant, red supergiant for the development of asymmetries, but aren't all of those asymmetries seeded in the first like 500 millisecond, 1 second of the explosion, while the shock is still very deep and doesn't really know the size of the hydrogen envelope?
The seeds are seeded at the start, like you say, but what happens next depends on how the shock propagates throughout the star.
Sure, it can amplify.
Yes.
Like, these perturbations can get amplified or
amplified.
quenched. Yeah, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Um,
Does it decelerate when hitting the hydrogen helium interface, for example, allowing those nickel plumes to catch up and seed the instabilities,
okay, I see.
which won't happen in a blue supergiant. The
Okay,
density
that's because
profile,
you don't accelerate that much because you don't have a density cliff.
well, you don't decelerate, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You actually accelerate through the steep density profile of a helium core, probably.
Okay, yeah, I see it. And the other thing is something that you said kind of as a throwaway sentence, but it was like you expect a given stellar structure to explode in a deterministic way, given the like if we understood the explosion, I give you a progenitor, you tell me what the explosion is with 1-to-1 mapping. But does that need to be the case, especially if these asymmetry are seeded somehow by convection before the explosion or something that is more like stochastic? Like if turbulence plays a role in all of these, then shouldn't you expect a statistical distribution of outcomes from the explosion of one particular progenitor?
Yeah, I do think that is probably true.
Because that maps also much better to what we expect with supernova kicks, which are a manifestation of these asymmetries.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the same neutron star can get different kicks, or at least that's what we assume in all the population models that we do. Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Or do you have a follow-up or?
I'm booked to talk to him right
That's
now,
great,
so
yeah.
I need to keep everybody.
Any last minute questions from folks? Yeah.
Thank you for the very nice talk. So I had a question about how you, in general, model the final moments of red supergiants before they explode, because this is like something observationally that we see constantly is that there are stellar winds or there's CSM associated with. So in general, previously the model inferences were just like, okay, I have a progenitor structure, I do put it on some CSM around and then just like explode and then see how that signatures are imprinted. But like I would like to know if in the new models that you're developing, are there like any instabilities that are going to induce those final moments that you're incorporating, which can distinguish maybe between like maybe there are winds versus there could be outbursts of material. So to my question is like, are there developments in that regime where in the newer models, those final moments are modeled differently, or like those pulsations are modeled differently?
I'm not familiar with any ongoing work for like the envelope that would impact the things that you're talking about. It certainly needs to be done, but I don't know of anyone that's really working on envelope modeling, at least like in the lifetime of the star.
Can add something maybe like, so there are, it's a research field.
Yeah.
The problem is having like a physical model in mind that you can put in a computer to what could drive late outbursts that you were referring to and stuff like that. So there is on the progenitor side some work that goes in that direction, but keep in mind that the vast majority of stellar models in the world are computed to carbon depletion.
Yeah.
Thousands of years before anything that
Yeah,
Brandon talked
yeah,
about.
yeah. That's why I was just thinking, like, can I push you? And that
Or collapse.
Try.
Yeah, I just want, so you mentioned something about using Gaussian processes to get better converged models. I just don't think I understood what did you mean over there by like better converged.
I mean, it depends on what you want. So for us, we were thinking about supernova progenitors. And so we wanted a grid of models in, SAM's mass that would, with as few models as possible, replicate the features that we see. And we were looking at iron core mass, for example. And we could find that we had something like 200 for the Kepler models, and we ran MESA models as well. We could get a grid with fewer models that was as good as recovering those features as a uniform grid with as many or more models.
But you were fixing like the other stuff of like single stars.
Oh yes, but it extends to
Okay.
multi-dimensional parameters. So, SAM's mass, metallicity, binary parameters. The nice thing about the Gaussian process algorithms is that you can spin up to whatever dimensionality you want.
So you trained those on Tug's models.
For this paper, we did some testing with Tug's models just as a toy, but then we also ran MESA models and built a grid adaptively in line.
I noticed that spike.
Yes. I didn't have a good figure for the MESA models on hand.
No, that's awesome. Any other questions for Brandon? Okay, let's thank Brandon again.